event to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Joseph Whitty, the youngest of the 22 who died on the 2nd of August 1923 in the Curragh camp under the Free State regime. Joe was just 18 years of age. Few knew he had died. Not many knew he was on a hunger strike. The Free State regime had imposed a news blackout. 58 years later, Kieran Doherty died on a hunger strike on the same date, the 2nd of August 1981. Same date, the 2nd of August. Yet the world knew about that because we then lived in very different times. And from the death of Bobby Sands onwards, the world's media was watching events here. And yet, throughout the hunger strike in 1981, the government here in the South also operated a censorship ban on Sinn Féin and Republicans. And that included Kieran, who was elected a TD while on hunger strike. Even in death, Republicans were to be feared. And whilst year and context were different, so too was the manner in which people died on hunger strike. Some like Michael Wee, who I spoke to a short time before his death, was sitting up in bed, smoking a cigarette. He was with Father Toner, the chaplain. At one point, Father Toner left the cell to get something. By the time he returned, Thomas was dead. And yet there were others who died very difficult and painful deaths. Martin Hurston was one of those, unable to keep water down. His kidneys soon gave him problems. And for the last few hours of his life, he lost control of his mind. Paddy Quinn from South Armagh survived the 1981 hunger strike. But he went through a similar experience as Martin. And I described it in the memoir I wrote recently, and which I'll read from now to give some idea of the horror of it. Pat McEwen and I were sitting in the corner of the hospital exercise yard. It was a mild day, warm but not sunny. We knew Paddy Quinn was going through a bad period, vomiting and unable to keep water down. We both knew how important it was to keep water down. Martin Hurston had died in part from dehydration. Suddenly, there was a loud sound from Paddy's cell. There was no warning of its approach. It came out of the blue, a very loud bellow. It was like the sound a cow makes at times, especially if distressed. The roar was repeated a number of times. We could only guess at the pain Paddy was going through. The roar would subside for a while and be followed by a high-pitched scream. Then what sounded like giggling or chanting in a very high-pitched voice. There would be an interval of silence, and it would start all over again, slowly building up to a very loud scream. This went on for about half an hour, and then it was time for us to come in from the yard again. Paddy had been silent for a while, or at least not as loud. But shortly after I locked up in my cell, he started again. It grew progressively loud. It was becoming much worse than earlier. There were less breaks in between the screams, and now more deep sighs or moans, possibly as a result of his body becoming totally exhausted. Soon after, I heard a woman's footsteps in the ward, and then heard her calling Paddy's name in a soothing way. "It's all right, Paddy. What's wrong, son?" It was his mother. I remember thinking that she was remarkably calm throughout what must have been a totally horrifying and heartbreaking experience. I knew the effect it was having on me just listening to him, but it must have been agonizing for her watching him, knowing that he was not in control of his mind and frantically struggling with himself. At one stage, his screams and yells built up to a very loud pitch and continued for some time. Then they were muffled. He still talked and muttered, mostly unintelligibly, but more quietly.
I wasn't in the prison hospital when Martin Horson died, but I heard from his brother Brendan years later that Martin went through somewhat similar experience to Paddy. Brendan and one of the prison chaplains, Father Murphy, held Martin down on either side because he was struggling frantically in the bed, and they were afraid that he would smash his face against the metal bed end. And then there were those who died not from the fact that they slowly starved to death, but through force feeding. The first of those was Thomas Ashe, who died after only a few days on hunger strike. And in the early 70s, Michael Gaughan and Frank Stagg both died from forced feeding, most likely through pneumonia brought on by the feeding tube piercing a lung and infection setting in. Jerry Kelly, who was force-fed with the Price sisters in Kew Feeney while on hunger strike in England, vividly describes that process of force feeding in his book, Playing My Part, and the horror of it. He tells of how a doctor had come into his cell and informed him after 19 days on hunger strike that they were going to force feed him. Jerry barricaded his cell, but the screws came and very soon pushed their way into the cell, pinned him down, and he was naked on the floor when the doctor came in. This is what Jerry says of that moment. The doctor instructed the guards to pull me up in the bed into a sitting position with my back against the tall metal bed end. At that stage, 2 guards were lying across my legs and 2 others had my arms pinned against the bed end. Under the doctor's instruction, I was held tighter in the jackknife position, and my head was pulled back by the hair over the top bar of the bed end. "Open your mouth now," ordered the doctor. I clenched my teeth as I could not move my head to indicate my no, and sensed that opening my mouth to answer was exactly what he needed. "I have no time for this," he said impatiently. One guard locked my head in a tight grip to prevent struggle, and then someone leaned on my chin to try to open my mouth. Another tried forcing my nose upwards, causing it to bleed. My lips were stretched apart in their attempt to force me to open my mouth. Knuckles were bored into my jaw joints. The doctor produced a Ryle's tube, which is a very narrow gauge nasal gastric feeding tube. It was a hard plastic tube, which he inserted into my nose. As it hit the back of my throat, I gagged. Immediately, the waiting MO shoved something between my teeth. The object turned out to be a piece of wood, with string at each end and containing a circular hole in the middle. The easiest way to describe it would be a horse bit. I found out moments later that its purpose was to hold my teeth apart, which would allow them to push much wider gauge tubing down my throat. The only part of my body that could move was my eyes. Therefore, I could not communicate my panic and fear as a rubber tube was pushed through the hole into my mouth. The tube made me gag as it hit the back flap of my throat. The epiglottis is a flap which is there to prevent food and drink being inhaled into the lungs. I was vividly aware that if the doctor had forced the tube down the wrong way, I would most likely die. I was aware that Thomas Ashe had died in this way while on hunger strike in Mountjoy prison in 1917. My feelings were of absolute helplessness and mental panic. The thick tube was lubricated with liquid paraffin, but it felt sore as it moved further inside me. At the end of the tube was a plastic funnel, which was held above my face. My panic increased as I watched the doctor pour a thick, milk-coloured liquid into the funnel. This panic and absolute helplessness would reoccur every time I was force-fed, and that was to take place 167 times. So, whether it's death through force feeding, or the body simply breaking down over time, either slowly or rapidly, death on hunger strike is not like a fatal bullet wound with death in an instant. There was nothing physically wrong with those we remember here today. They weren't hit with a bullet or caught in an explosion. They had no disease, They didn't require any operation or medical treatment. What they demanded was justice. Their deaths came about as a decision to refuse to go along with the conditions and circumstances of their time, conditions imposed upon them by oppressive regimes of whatever hue. Today, we still demand justice, equality, democracy and a new reunified Ireland. The demands for a reunified Ireland have become louder as more and more people regard it now as the only viable option. Times have indeed changed. Today, Sinn Féin is the largest party in the south and the north, something that was never meant to happen, especially in the north, which had a border constructed in such a way as to ensure a unionist majority in perpetuity. Republicans are rightly proud of the amazing strides we've taken and the gains we have made. We also know there's a road still to be travelled. All those successes have been built upon the struggle and sacrifice of many people. People like the 22 who died on hunger strike in the last century. And whilst I think it important to remember them in particular, I always think it important on occasions such as this to recall that many other volunteers died on active service. And again, many more than that died naturally after giving perhaps 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of their lives. And then there were the thousands, indeed tens of thousands, of people without whom we would not be where we are today. It's a very broad struggle, and I do think it's important on these occasions to remember that. So let's end with the words of one hunger striker who summed up that sentiment, Bobby Sands. Everyone, Republican or otherwise, has their own particular part to play. No part is too great or too small. No one is too old or too young to do something. Give me a mish or two, we'll hear you. For a minute, my office.
Just before we conclude, I hope you can all hear me, but I'd just like to invite Imelda Munster, TD, up to make a small presentation to Lawrence McKeown, a token of our appreciation for joining us here today for this commemoration.